Bonjour, welcome to the Fremantle Arts Centre. My name's Anna and I'm the director here. I would, before we go any further, like to acknowledge that we are gathered here tonight in Wollyalup on Whadjuk Noongar Budja and pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging, and also a very heartfelt welcome and acknowledgement for any First Nations person in the room, in the gardens with us tonight. So tonight we welcome Gemma Weston for our inaugural disclosure. Gemma Weston is a curator and an arts administrator whose work is informed by a background in artistic practice. She is 1.5 weeks into a brand new role at Art on the Move as exhibitions touring manager, but has most recently delivered the 2020, 2021 and the 2022 Perth Festival Visual Arts program, supported by program partner Wesfarmers Arts as the Visual Arts Programming Associate. Critically, in this role, can I say, Gemma has been an enabler, a facilitator, a champion and a true advocate for the visual arts sector in Western Australia, and really importantly how it is platformed and how it is celebrated in the context of a major multidisciplinary arts festival, which is no easy task. Prior to Perth Festival, Gemma was the curator of the Crothers collection of women's art at Lawrence Wilson Art Gallery from 2013 to 2019, and she has also co-founded 2 artist-run initiatives, OK Gallery and Pet Projects. Please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Gemma Weston for our inaugural disclosure lecture.
Ooh. Technical difficulties. Okay, great. Thanks, thank you, Anna, for that wonderful welcome. I'd also just like to start by acknowledging the Noongar people whose land we meet on tonight, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. It's a beautiful night to be in Wollyalup, and I wanted to thank you all for coming out to listen to me, and to thank Glenn and Anna for the opportunity to deliver this inaugural address. So I've been asked tonight to respond in some way, whatever way I chose, to a provocation, which was what's text got to do with it? The provocation begins with the exhibition Undertow, which has the ocean at its heart but is also awash with text. As an exhibition, it offers a series of journeys into each artist's unique relationship with the ocean, and in doing so it rushes our own personal ocean stories to the surface. In the text that frames the exhibition, Glenn says, "Every wave writes a history. Every subsequent wave might also erase one. Imagine each wave as the past made manifest, each wave as a fresh start." On the walls inside there are words, statements, memories, a glossary, a poem, a rhythm of words set against the wordless roar of the waves. And I had thought initially that this is what I would write about, what felt at surface level thinking to be a contradiction between the borders created by a word and the widest horizon and the deepest depths. But I got stuck at some point on this word, contradiction, on the idea that there was something oppositional about words and what's beyond them, and also, as the provocation implies, between text and this other thing that we call art. An opposition implies a fight of some kind, and either or, and the West loves a binary, and we as artists and curators often love them too, because they allow us to claim a position in opposition to the binary, this thing we're always trying on as the space between. And so I wanted to think about why I reached initially for this oppositional framework, when perhaps these things come from the same impulse, which is simply to communicate. So for context, what I've landed on is a real patchwork of ideas. It's a series of fragments about words, kind of loosely held together as a whole, because honestly that's where I am at the moment as a person, very far away from being able to frame any kind of coherent argument, and my own practice, as well as Anna might have signalled in that bio of thinking, of writing and doing, is itself kind of a patchwork. It's I'm not an academic, not entirely a curator, occasionally a writer, but in a very niche field. I dabble at being an artist, but what I've mostly been for the last 3 years or so is an administrator dabbling in creative thinking. And so I just wanted to put that out there, just in case you were expecting some kind of comprehensive history or a coherent theory. I'm out of practice and out of love with those. So this text is full of its own contradictions, and I mostly use this as an opportunity to figure out what I think about the subject. To have taken some creative license in some places and have some fun with some words, and hoping something that will spark in the relationship between these parts. So I'm also going to use this to chase away some art school ghosts. So I've got a really thick wad of paper here, and we're still in preamble mode. So to fully brief you in, I've prepared something that obviously I'm going to read, and then there's some images to go with it, so you'll at least have something to look at if things get real dry. And full warning, parts of this are quite dense, and I probably overthought it quite a lot because that's who I am. Yeah. There's a bit about Socrates at the end, just so you know. Also, there's a few curse words if those things are going to offend you. So if I don't talk too fast, I should be up here for about 30 to 45 minutes, depending, including this bit. And then, as Anna mentioned, after that there'll be some time for questions. And after those questions, I'm going to be having a post-public speaking shame spiral somewhere on the ground. So. If you don't ask a question publicly, or you really want to tell me that I'm wrong about something, you can come and talk to me then. Okay. Oh, I meant to turn this. I was meant to be talking to this background of the ocean as I said that, but okay, that's fine. I've also just realised that this has a stock photo thing on it, which I haven't seen until now, really. But we're talking about the relationship between text and image, so maybe thematically that's fine. Okay, let's begin. Okay, chapter 1, Big Soup. Do you think in words or in images? Can you say for certain? I have this picture in my head of a kind of primordial soup, a swamp of colour and noise and feeling that solidifies into the shape of words, like mercury bouncing on an audio speaker. When I can't think of the right word, I see a picture like a screensaver of an office worker shuffling through a filing cabinet. Eventually the answer will appear, but as a word and not an image. I also have a narrative voice that I discovered lying in bed at age 16 one morning, thinking through a school assignment that could write things for me that I could later remember and transcribe as though I was channeling something from outside myself. I describe this to someone who writes fiction, and he says, "What do you mean, just one?" Over Christmas, my sister, who has a habit of working through problems out loud, told me it was her New Year's resolution to think more things in her head. I recounted this to a work colleague while we were waiting in line for something, a person who is both so sharp and generous that I'm often terrified of the precision of her language, and she said, "Yes, that's me as well. I have colours and shapes, but no words." There are statistics for this, if it helps, on Wikipedia. Apparently 30% of the surveyed population strongly uses visual spatial thinking. Another 45% uses both visual spatial thinking and words, and 25% think in words alone. So knowing this, it's a miracle that we can reach out across the void between us and connect it all. And so why wouldn't we as artists use everything in our toolkit? Okay, part 2. Undergraduate shower thoughts. The paradox of words is that they define an idea while also inserting another layer of abstraction. Compare an image of a tree, where we know something immediately of height and width and location, of weather and time of year perhaps, the cliche of 1,000 words, to the singular word tree, an arrangement of symbols formed into a larger symbol that requires, when written down, literacy as well as vision. Somehow, though, the word tree is both more and less precise than the image, which are then each a disembodiment of the real thing. Perhaps it's this real thing at the heart of the abstraction that points to the appeal of text for artists who might otherwise work and play in the world of images and form. A word can be immediate visual shorthand for when the real thing is something for which there is no tangible referent, nothing so physical as a tree to fix on. Where the space between us as individuals, each with our own internal soup, risks inserting noise into a statement that wants to be made with some urgency. For example, how else do you make an image or a sculpture of silence, of rage, of guilt, of luck, that can attach to another person with a quickness and weight with quickness and weight, with staying power. A visual abstraction, even a play with sound, might eventually produce the feeling or the idea of silence, but the word silence offers directness in command and in concept. And then, in a clever sentence, more words can turn this back on itself to connect two moments of seeming precision in a way that fucks up that precision entirely and pulls the rug out from beneath us. Getting there. John Berger, author of the long-taught book and television series Ways of Seeing, once said that the boon of language is that potentially it is complete. It has the potentiality of holding with words the totality of human experience. The key word is potentially, in that it can't. There are plenty of things that words won't hold, and the surest way of finding that out is by putting them together. An example, courtesy of Undertow, is Yamatji Noongar artist Amanda Bell from her installation inside Balak, Naked. Our silence is full of rage. Silence, a word that suggests absence, is made to burst at the seams. Suddenly, hovering around that word are all of those unsaid things. Or Sam Blaw's twin mirrors, Lucky Country, held in the reflection of illegal bodies. Privilege given and then retracted inside the same pair of statements. A whole nation in that negative space. FYI, the missing parts of that phrase, Lucky Country, from David Holmes' 1964 book of the same name go like this. Australia is a lucky country mainly run by second-rate people who share its luck. It lives on other people's ideas, and although its ordinary people are adaptable, most of its leaders, brackets, in all fields, so lack certainty about the events that surround them, that they are often taken by surprise. Just to be more specific, and to go back to statistics again, in 2016, 72.7% of the Australian population, according to ABS data, spoke English only. The most spoken languages after English in the Australian continent are Mandarin, Arabic, Cantonese and Vietnamese. We don't have data yet from the 2021 census, but if the trend follows, the number of only English speakers will continue to drop. And if anyone wants to get shitty about Australian values, although I want to assume that this won't happen here, that we speak English at all in this place on Noongar Boodja is of course entirely unnatural. It's an act of force, a kind of violence, enacted through government policy which has overwritten first languages of over 500 First Nations. I'm among that 72.7% that speaks only English. My mother studied French and German at university and can still speak them, and while I took a few languages at high school, I remain embarrassingly and lazily monolingual. My family in both directions has been on this continent for a few generations. We are of the colony, we are the colony, white Australia, and have thus been allowed ourselves to think of being bilingual as an option, another language, something to be picked up at school by choice, rather than being forcefully schooled out of us. I turned my monolingual education in a regional West Australian high school into an art degree at a regional West Australian university in the early millennium, and thus was taught a cobbled together art historical canon that began with the caves at Lascaux in France, accelerated through ancient Greece towards Renaissance Italy, returned to France for fin de siècle modernity, emigrated with those artists to post-World War II America, and then stayed there for the rest of the lesson. This whole collage was then studded with moments from colonial Australian art, arranged roughly to follow the same linear progression, from landscape painting to postmodernism, and overlaid with a thin gauze of critical deconstruction. So when we occasionally did look at Aboriginal artists at all, it was through the lens of something called post-colonial theory, as though it had ended the colony and we've moved on. This Frankenstein's canon is of course taught in English, a kind of metaphysical extension of the project of colonisation through time and place to claim 300 BC Greece, 1500s Italy, 1980s America as a natural extension of English culture. In saying this, I just want to be clear that when I speak about text and art, this is a framework I bring, and because of this I'm conscious, probably not conscious enough, that some of what I experience in Revelation is likely dumbly obvious to roughly 30% of the population and a good part of the rest of the world. Part 4. Art history is often terrible. Here is some of that canon in action. From the Tate Modern, quote, "Ever since the Cubists first collaged real newspaper and bottle labels into their still life paintings in around 1912, artists have been making use of printed letters and words to add visual interest and texture to their work." Oh, I have an image for that. There it is. From an article from a listicle, actually, let's be specific, titled 8 Artists Who Harness the Power of Words in Art. When Magritte famously wrote, "Ceci n'est pas un pipe, this is not a pipe," across his painting of a pipe, he moved text to a central role in understanding the work. From a learning resource at the Museum of Modern Art, who at least thought to add a qualifier. Though text has been used in art long before this, artists like Joseph Kosuth in the 1960s were among the first to give words a central role. While it's obviously unwise to give a listicle too much credit, these statements all capture something real about the history of text in art and how it is taught. Something real about how the history of text in art is taught. It's an important distinction. How it has been taught to me, at least. Following again a forward guard that advances alongside new technologies until it talks itself into a false conclusion, a corner, wondering what to do now history is ended and time continues. It's a powerful story, and I know it almost as by rote. It goes like this. The increasing complexity of society in Europe at the end of the 19th century, including the development of new technologies for producing both images and texts, like photography, the music image, and the personal typewriter, which produced and circulated an increasing amount of information, as well as the advent of the consumer commodity brought about by the Industrial Revolution, led to an unfolding crisis of the image in art. This begins with Impressionism and Fauvist experimentation with brushstroke and colour, and escalates into the addition of real objects, including newsprint, into a canvas, the beginning of collage. Turning a page. The sanctity of a picture plane as pure representation is now under attack, and meaning is in freefall, and a world war doesn't help, and eventually Magritte, associated with the French surrealists, can't help but be struck around 1926 by the genius notion that an image is not in fact the real thing, and perhaps we've been lied to this whole time. Treachery. And so forevermore, the presence of text in art the presence of text in an art object must mean that we are no longer looking, now we are thinking, now we have discourse. And we pushed through the 1930s, the Great Depression, another world war, pop art, a Europe and America, and by extension, baby cousin Australia, just drowning in content, increasingly detached from meaning, signs detached from reference, coming to terms with new ways of seeing, God and the author dead. And we arrive eventually at that triumph of semiotics, Joseph Kosuth's 1 and 3 chairs, or 1 and 3 shovels, or 1 and 3 plants, or 1 and 3 glasses, or whatever that is, or 1 and 3 boxes, 1 and 3 anything, a work that will supposedly give us a genius new take on Magritte by adding in the real thing as well, a work supposedly disrupting the art object as commodity and moving it towards the esoteric and highbrow realm of dematerialisation and pure intellect, while still somehow repeating the experiment enough times so every museum of the world can own one of these 1 and 3 objects. A work that somebody probably had to make eventually in order if only so we never had to again. We reach the advent of conceptual art, defined by the condition where what the art looks like, and this is a quote, is less important than the ideas surrounding it, the idea, a machine that makes the art. The epitome of this being Art and Language, a New York group that included Australian artists Ian Byrne and Mel Ramsden exhibiting a filing cabinet of published material in 1972, a document of 5. And so we come to learn that in this story that words in art, that we must be ready to either mount an attack or to build a barricade around an aesthetic experience, around sensuality, around pleasure or pain. For text to begin in art in this way, a mid-century product of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, we must ignore just so many things, among them being that Sol LeWitt described conceptual artists not as rationalists, but as mystics, that curator and critic Lucy Lippard, whose thinking most clearly defined the movement, followed the social promise of the fine art object's disappearance into text and idea, into feminist and activist labour, feminist and labour activism. That there are other older ways that text and image can work together, that in the beginning was the word, that text can be holy and magic, that the calligraphy of Persia, China, Japan, places with which Western Europe had, at the time of the invention of collage, well-documented aesthetic obsessions or trade relationships with, had for centuries offered meditation on the relationship in text, on text and image. That perhaps the circle is a better model for thinking about cultural influence than the line, that forms of media can endure or can make a comeback, and that it's unlikely that anyone has done it has done anything first. Though I guess that sentence is kind of a failure because somebody has to always do something first. That text can have a kind of vibrational force, that the word spell doesn't also contain the word spell, that as well as deconstructing, words might also be a way of manifesting, of incantation, of speaking to gods or conjuring ancestors. This narrative is also one that has been built after the fact, disguising a much more complex time with the lazy repetition of a hyper-focused bias towards particular voices. French theorist Roland Barthes, whose writing on text and object has defined a fair bit of this period, had enough awareness at least of Chinese calligraphy to gesture towards it in a 1973 essay, Variations on Writing, where he celebrated it as a text where the communication function, I'm going to do this every time I'm quoting, quote, the communication function, which our linguists transform into an answer to everything, is subsequent, derivative, secondary to an aesthetic or ritual form. And he had enough of a window outside of the European continent to write an affectionate letter in 1971 to Argentinian artist Mirtha de Masache, who perfected a kind of asemic writing, capturing the impulse towards expression under a junta that oppressed it. Mirtha, who produced the first of her books in 1967 and worked up into her death in 2012, who avoided exhibiting her work in galleries, who instead thought of these drawings as a facet of social practice, teaching a workshop of creative actions to inverted commas non-artists, and publishing the journal, The Days of Colour and Form, both inviting fellow Argentinians into collective art making. Mirtha, who made it into Roland Barthes' correspondence, but into few art history books until more recently, until, as usual, after her death. If anything, this narrative, this progress from French collage to American concept, to endless discourse and an edifice of artist statement in galleries everywhere that mimic the form of translated French post-structuralism, is itself an exercise in magical thinking. It requires an irrational belief in the superior genius of whiteness, as an edifice placed above rather than in relation to all other cultures. It's a reminder we should be cautious of simplified lineages and definitely listicles, and of anything, really, that claims to be first. On the subject of Roland Barthes. In the 2002 essay that sits behind this painting, Bell's Theorem, Kamilaroi artist Richard Bell outlines the means by which Aboriginal artists have been alienated from their work by the white art world and the means by which they must reclaim power. In it, he takes on Roland Barthes' 1967 text, The Death of the Author. Bell makes the point that the appropriation of Aboriginal stories and identity by non-Aboriginal artists and arts workers has been facilitated by this key moment in postmodernist thinking. In the text, Barthes claimed that the modern scripter is, this is a quote again, born simultaneously with the text and is no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing, that any text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centres of cultures, which might be fine if he didn't follow that with, and I quote, to give a text an author is to oppose a limit on that text. This idea that the birth of the reader must come at the cost of the death of the author, that the connection between the identity of the author and the interpretation of the text produced by that author can be broken, fueled decades of artwork exploring quotation, language games, and appropriation. The idea that any source material could be cleanly removed from its context and used freely by anyone. As Richard Bell acknowledges, the possibility of being read beyond identity is not an equal opportunity activity. It's also worth noting that a fervour in Western art schools and galleries for killing the author for the benefit of the reader might be usefully read in relation to the escalation of movements worldwide like civil rights, second-wave feminism, and in the wake of nations across Asia and Africa achieving autonomy and independence from their European colonial rulers, reclaiming their languages and voices. In activist materials produced by any of these sources, as it is in Richard Bell's work, the identity of the speaker is fundamental to the interpretation of the text. It does not oppose a limit, but it certainly shapes a response. The death of the author might then hide a subconscious wish. If we can't control meaning, then perhaps we can destroy it. 6. Abuse of power should come as no surprise. In 2016, cresting the wave of the Harvey Weinstein moment, women of the art world, but mostly the art world in America, published an open letter demanding the end of sexual harassment. They used one of Jenny Holtz's truisms as a title. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. For context, if you need it, American artist Jenny Holtz's truisms are another one of the most famous text works of the 20th century, realised in media from LED signs to paste-up to projections to T-shirts around the world since late 1970s. And although they've been repeated more times than Joseph Kossuth's 1 and 3 gag, I'm still not mad at them. These statements have a complex unease that transcends time. They feel general and personal. They have a distinct cadence and voice. It's worrying, in fact, how relevant they remain to today. The texts aren't for or against a specific cause, but they feel like activism. Protect me from what I want. Raise boys and girls the same. Murder has a sexual element. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. The shock of seeing something that feels as though it is known innately, that's spoken privately from a place deep in the psyche, in an unexpected and public place, shakes the consciousness awake. Anyway, a few days after this letter had been published, a man in the art world, less powerful now than then, but still, said to me without irony that he thought the letter would have had more impact if the title of the work it borrowed from was, and I quote, less of a cliche. I thought, but I didn't say, that a way to avoid that statement becoming a cliche might be just simply to stop abusing power in the first place. It's worth remembering that a cliche is not true. What is the difference between a cliche, a truism, an archetype? Any knowledge that lives inside the body is instinct. As an aside, the word cliche comes to us from the printing press. It's an onomatopoeic interpretation of the clicking sound a press makes, clish, 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 as it wears out a plate, which, in case you were wondering, is called a stereotype. What does it mean that a word that implies that truth can wear itself useless through repetition might only be as old as the technology for reproducing that truth en masse? How useful is it to bend the idea of something eternal through the metaphorical prism of something so new and such a human invention? Okay, this is where we get to Socrates. Old school. If I must be pushed down the path of Western civilization, then I'm going back to the source. Here's some pictures. This is hard to illustrate. Around 370 BC, Plato completed several texts capturing philosophical dialogues with Socrates. There is Republic and Symposium, and there is a Phaedrus. In this last text, Socrates is walking in the countryside where he bumps into a friend, Phaedrus, who has just witnessed a series of speeches given in the home of another peer. Socrates, who is sick with the love of hearing speeches, directs Phaedrus to pause and recount what he has heard. They sit by a stream under a tree and talk, and what follows is a dialogue on the proper use of rhetoric, on what is good and bad in speech writing and art, and on love. A key moment in the third speech involves a revelation that Phaedrus is carrying a transcript of the speech and can thus recite it verbatim. In response, an unsatisfied Socrates embarks on a critique of the written word. Writing claims to be in the service of memory, but it produces, quote, the opposite of its true effect. If men learn this, it will implant forgetfulness on their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written. It is no true wisdom that you offer your disciples, but only the semblance of wisdom. And this. The strange thing about writing, which makes it truly correspond to painting, is that the painter's products stand before us as though they were alive. But if you question them, they maintain a most majestic silence. An image of a pipe is not a pipe, but an image of a word produces an effect just as unreal. Socrates seems to suggest that the static nature of writing and painting will mean that the message is always received by the audience in the same way, something that the last few thousand years have done something to disprove. But either way, text and image seem always to have been understood to be inextricably linked. All writing is, after all, an image. Many interpretations of this passage fix on the contradiction of including such a warning against writing inside a text designed to preserve speech. Because of this, Socrates' skepticism about a new technology is often connected in these interpretations through a series of jump cuts through time to other moments where advancements in technology of reproduction and circulation have been met by fear, doubt, and moral panic, which are always eventually overcome by the sheer power and complexity of the new tool. For example, writing will cause an epidemic of forgetfulness, just as the printing press will cause the decay of religious morals when the hands of monks freed from their transcribing duties grow idle. The novel will ruin women, just as too much television will rot our brains and the internet will lead to the atomization and eventual collapse of society. But hey, you can't fight progress. Once again, a linear narrative, a hierarchy of progress, speaking and image-making cultures, superseded by writing cultures, and if we follow this logic, eventually perhaps by shitposting cultures, as though written history had never lost anything for us, as if the time when the world wasn't soft, as if the time when the world was soft wasn't still alive in oral storytelling. I prefer to think that what this dialogue shows us is not a hierarchy of progress, but the suggestion that new things are not necessarily better, only different. An argument for something the art world annoyingly calls medium specificity, each medium to their own, each medium shaping the message. Speaking does one thing, writing does another. Who truly knows anymore exactly what painting is doing, but it is definitely something that only painting can do. Socrates, yet to become acquainted with Instagram comments and the specific thrill of purposely misinterpreting something to annoy a man on the internet, advocates for the superiority of speaking one-on-one, not because he is sceptical of new tools, but because he believes it is the medium that answers a more important question. This is not what a text or a painting or a speech does, but what communication at its root is for. Or, to paraphrase Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, perhaps we've thought so long about what we could do with text and images, we forgot to ask whether or why we should. The answer in the Phaedrus, thanks for that pity laugh, that's I really appreciate that, I really do. The answer is in the Phaedrus. The answer in the Phaedrus is to that question, is that it's for connection, soul to soul. After all, it's a text about love. From feeling to meaning. There's a quote from Australian art critic Robert Hughes, which Sydney-based artist Agatha Goth-Snape has turned into a series of text-based works. Robert Hughes hated a lot of things, but he at least believed in art as a project of human connection. Here it is in full. The basic project of art is always to make the world whole and comprehensible, to restore it to us in all of its glory and its occasional nastiness, not through argument, but through feeling, and then to close the gap between you and everything that is not you, and in this way pass from feeling to meaning. From feeling to meaning. Let's try this out. Stand in that room and tell me honestly that you aren't thinking and that you are thinking and not feeling. Tell me your guts haven't dropped as though off a cliff. Of course the text should be read on deep blue, because rage as a feeling is both hot and cold. Feel it, the flash of hotness, the prickle of skin. Of course the text should be the size of the body. We should feel it, one to one. It should envelop us like architecture, and we should be asked to live inside of it. Of course it should be like handwriting because it is hers, and of course it should be sleek and mechanical as well, because the scale of the injustice and the pain is just that, industrial and systematic. Of course it should be neon because it should burn and hum. You should see it when you close your eyes. Of course there should be the short, sharp shock of the statement against the long wail of the poem and the insertion of the original language of this place where you are standing, Noongar. Of course we should leave the room and breathe out finally, as though we are allowed to be relieved, as though there isn't also a place where it never stops. Of course it should be beautiful. That's what will make it hurt the most. Of course the sun should fix a word in Quandamooka into cloth. It should be elemental, made with light and with water. It should be forever held in time, a record of what always was and always will be, a continuum. Of course there should be a glossary because these words are loved, and speaking them, understanding them, knowing what they mean will keep them alive. Speaking them is resuscitation, and speaking them is care. Of course, the font should make us feel nostalgic, because we need then to be sideswiped by the knowledge that there were no simpler times. It should be like garage signs your grandfather painted on the Shell service station opposite the York Town Hall, and you should feel the sucker punch of feeling sweetly about a place where terrible things have also happened. Of course, the font should feel factual but not authoritative, that it should talk to you like a mate in the pub delivering a hard truth. The font is called Billboard, and it's made to speak at the scale of the commercial, but with the voice of the individual, to be handmade and slow as well as slippery. Of course, it should feel like the floor is opening up, like a portal into Hades, and it should feel like a long way down. Of course, the text should describe the feeling it produces, complicitness, despair, shaded gently with hope. And of course, there should be words hurled into the ocean, worlds that wash up on the shore. It's the perfect place for them, and there is no contradiction. Standing against something beyond words is a perfect place to feel the boundaries of yourself, and then to feel the boundaries of yourself dissolve. A place to reach out across the void, even in the cursed framework of English. You and everything that is not you. Everything we say to the ocean is some version of this, and everything we say to each other is some version of this. I am alive, and we are alive together. So what do we do now? And that's the end. I don't know what time it was or whether I read that too fast. It's strange up here in the light, not being able to see anybody. Thank you for listening, and I'm sorry for stumbling a little bit. That's a big package of ideas, and I hope there's some things to talk about later on. Okay.